Hello, my name is Bob Doman. I'm the founder and director of the National Association for Child Development. This little video is one of a series we're doing on issues related to children with Down syndrome. In this little video, I'm going to talk about issues relative to how the child processes sound. In a previous video, I talked about structural issues relative to the ear, palate, throat that affect some of this development. But if we have issues with structure, we have issues with middle ear fluid and such, we end up with problems with auditory tonal processing. Problems with auditory tonal processing also are associated with problems with what's called figure ground. And all that leads to issues with sequential processing, cognition, language, speech, and all the associated pieces. If we delay the quality of input and quantity of input that the brain receives auditorily through hearing, often what happens, we have problems with processing of specific frequencies of sound. A good way to understand frequencies is that in different languages, different frequencies are emphasized. So you can say, yeah, I hear well, I hear perfectly, but someone could walk in and say something in Greek, and you could repeat exactly what you heard, and you would not repeat it correctly because there's frequencies there that your brain is not processing well. So anytime we have an issue with a child with middle ear fluid or anything affecting the development of auditory tonal processing, we're going to have issues with specific frequencies. Now, you may get an audiogram done of your child, and you may say, Johnny seems to hear, the airplane and the bus, and when I talk to him, and all those things indicate there is not a hearing problem. Well, none of those things really are conclusive to determine whether or not Johnny has a hearing problem. An audiogram typically tests 6 frequencies out of about 20,000 frequencies your brain can process. All right, and the way we have discovered, what we've seen with auditory processing, tonal processing, when we examine it carefully, is you can have very specific frequencies that are fine. You can have a frequency very close to that is overemphasized, that the child's hypersensitive to, and then another frequency close to that that's understated, the child does not process well enough. All of that produces distortion. The more distortion there is in what the child hears, the more difficult it becomes for the child to actually process what is being said, the more difficult it is for the child to learn how to articulate those sounds, to speak, and then to link those sounds together into words and phrases and sentences, and ultimately conversational language. So addressing auditory tonal issues is mandatory for most of our children with Down syndrome. The next piece is issues with figure ground processing. The brain of young children tends to concentrate more on high and low frequencies of sound, which, if you will, are more environmental sounds than the language ranges of sound. And what tends to happen if the development is slowed down, the brain gets too good at attending to those frequencies and not attending well enough to those frequencies where within the language range. And the longer this goes on, the more figure ground issues we have, which means the child, rather than being able to attend to the speech, the language that they're hearing, their brain is tending to attend to the higher and lower frequencies of sound. So they're not processing the language well. They're also constantly being distracted by those high and low frequencies. All right, the figure ground issues are very, very common problems and also need to be addressed. All right, so if you start looking at hearing, you can see that there's a lot more to it than simply doing an audiogram or simply looking at your child and say, yeah, they seem to hear what I say. They seem to hear those sounds around them. Very, very possibly they are doing all that, but we have very significant auditory tonal processing issues, and we also have serious figure ground issues. Those issues then create problems with what's called sequential processing. The brain has to learn how to process pieces of auditory information in a sequence. You know, your baby first learns to process an individual sound or phoneme. Then they can put phonemes together and start processing words. Then they can put more of those together and start processing phrases and then sentences. What they put out in terms of their language is a reflection largely of that sequential processing. Also, part of their maturity is a reflection of their sequential processing, because their sequential processing determines complexity of thought. And complexity of thought ultimately is what determines your behavior and, if you will, your maturity. So these pieces are very, very significant. And we're going to talk more in terms of auditory tonal processing, auditory figure ground processing, and auditory sequential processing. All very, very important, significant factors if we are going to really assist our kids in achieving their potential. Thanks.